It happened in the outskirts of Boston. Smugglers Joel and Tess caught wind of a new smuggling job from the leader of the Fireflies, a resistance group. Apparently this was going to be the biggest, most important job of their lives. They just had to follow her across town to pick up the cargo. The three of them made their way across town, laying low from guards patrolling the area. The city had been under lockdown since a fungal infection took over the world, wiping out most of the population. The fungus eroded human brains, making them mindless husks of the people they once were. The world had become more militarized, more desperate, more violent. On a narrow rooftop sat a collection of men making sure the area was secure. They were in the way, so they had to be taken care of. After clumsily sneaking around, Joel was spotted by one of the guards. The guard ran up to Joel and started punching him. He fell to the ground, blood running down his face. He lost consciousness. Then he lost his life. If it isn't obvious, I'm terrible at stealth games. I appreciate stealth games. They no doubt have an important place in the gaming world, and I do like them. I'm just bad at them. The Last of Us is not strictly a stealth game, but it does feature quite a bit of sneaking around. Popping out of the shadows to ambush someone is super satisfying, but messing it up, I did that a lot. So on my most recent playthrough of The Last of Us, I had a fateful run-in with a group of guards embarrassingly early in the story. But after a quick loading screen, Joel was back, facing those same guards. His slip-up was no more than a forgivable accident, a minor setback. This time he took care of all of them, and the trio continued on their way. They met the precious cargo, a girl named Ellie, and had to take her across the city. And they did. Through storm drains, through train stations, through crumbling buildings, they trekked across Boston, towards the drop-off point, the Capitol building. There were close calls. Tess was attacked in a museum. Joel met his end shortly afterward and got another chance at life. Joel, Tess, and Ellie arrived at their destination, only to discover that the deal had gone south. And then Tess revealed that during the skirmish at the museum, she had become infected. She too would soon lose control over her body. The Capitol building fell under attack. She urged us to go, and we did. We never saw her again. The Last of Us sits at the intersection of two mediums. On the one hand, it is very much a video game. A player controls a character through various challenges that they must overcome. They need to make decisions and think on their feet to make it to the next sequence. Yet, at the same time, it pulls quite a bit from the world of film. This is a story-driven experience that puts its emphasis on how the story unfolds. Minigames, both from long before and long after The Last of Us, contain well-written, linear stories. But because this game sits so firmly in the center of this intersection, it reveals just how hard it is to reconcile these two mediums. The Last of Us reveals a great irony, not just with itself, but with games as a whole. When it released back in 2013, Naughty Dog's The Last of Us started a whirlwind of conversation. It was bestowed with glowing review scores and was immediately heralded as a modern classic. But even beyond the immaculate critical praise and audience reception, many credited it with pushing the entire medium of video games forward. The Last of Us was a game changer. It was a game changer in the sense that it proved to the gaming agnostic public that interactive media could, in fact, tell a compelling story. Of course, to those of us who had been playing games for a while, we already knew that games could make us laugh, or cry, or think, or marvel. From RPGs to first-person shooters, games had been telling emotionally impactful stories for ages by the time The Last of Us rolled around. So, why The Last of Us? Why was this game saddled with this reputation? The word cinematic gets thrown around a lot when it comes to discussing games that put an emphasis on their stories. The word itself literally means like cinema, or relating to motion pictures, and while that definition is pretty cut and dry, calling a game cinematic can mean a variety of things. For example, I'd call Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy VII, and Ocarina of Time cinematic due to the emphasis that they put on their stories and how visual information is presented. Yet these titles are all pushing against technical limitations. From long codec calls to low-poly character models to speech that has to be read instead of listened to, these aspects stand in the way of these games being truly like cinema to a non-gaming public. But since the start of the HD era, developers aren't as beholden to those limitations. The Last of Us implements full-body motion capture with actors in the same room. The performers can improvise and play off of each other. The virtual camera can move like a real camera, complete with lenses simulating different focal lengths. Scenes can have more intentional lighting and immersive audio design. Games can be even more like cinema. But that comes at a cost. Games that put a heavy emphasis on their narrative have to wrestle with a fundamental issue. Who gets the most control over how the story plays out? In a film, the script, direction, performances, and editing choices are concrete. They can't change from viewing to viewing. The audience has no authority whatsoever. But in a game, the developer has the option of conceding some of that authority. They can allow the player to have a little bit of say in the decision-making process. For example, in something like Half-Life or BioShock, the player is in control of the player character at all times, and that includes the story scenes. These games don't have cutscenes in the traditional sense. Instead, the action will unfold around the character, aiding in a sense of immersion. The player can look at whoever or whatever they want to as these scenes unfold. The developers have bartered a trade. For the benefit of a more immersive and tactile world, they have handed over the scene direction to the player. There's no director controlling what appears and doesn't appear in each camera shot. The audience decides what the audience should focus on. So while the story has been decided from the outset, the small details of how the story is presented are fully up to the player. Valve and 2K are still ultimately in control, but they've given the player some control. But at the same time, the player might not look in the right places at the right time. There's no guarantee that the way a player looks at a scene is the best way to look at a scene. In Portal 2, another Valve joint, there's a sign that implores the player to look at an implosion. Rumor has it that this sign is there to discourage players from turning around and not seeing what the developers want them to see, in this case, the implosion. But they ultimately have no control over what the player does. By allowing the player this amount of finite control, there will inevitably be some concessions like this, but that's just part of the trade. The developer ultimately has to be okay with the player not looking at the implosion. But Naughty Dog isn't willing to make that trade, not at all. The Last of Us reveals visual information in one specific way. A scene like this, for example.
Get down.
Works best with this sort of framing and camera movement. The same with this jump scare. Or this cut to show time passing. To tell the story it wants to, The Last of Us has to retain control of its camera and editing choices. Like in a film, the way in which a scene plays out is critical. During the 7th console generation, open-world games hit the mainstream. The Grand Theft Auto series sold gangbusters, Skyrim was a monumental success, as was the Assassin's Creed series. Even Batman moved from the labyrinthian asylum of the first Arkham game to the greater Gotham City in its sequels. Open world was now the quote-unquote correct way to structure a game. But the developers of open world games have to relinquish a critical aspect of how a story unfolds: its pacing. Typically, an open world game has a main story it's telling over the course of the campaign, but there are also copious amounts of side stories and missions that the player can take on as they see fit. Not to mention just exploring and causing trouble is also part of the fun. This style of game gives the player more freedom to do what they want to do in the sandbox the developers have created. But at the same time, it's hard to tell a story with any sort of urgency in this framework. Getting from point A to point B isn't always the top priority when there's a lot of fun stuff to do in between. So while the developer can determine what the core story is, they don't really have much control over the pace at which it unfolds. The timing of the story beats is all up to the player. And in the case of something like a Grand Theft Auto game, that's totally fine. Explore and make trouble to your heart's content. The story will be there when you're ready for it. Meanwhile, The Last of Us stands in stark opposition to this in vogue structure. The world unfolds one area at a time. Frequently, Joel and Ellie will vault over a wall, permanently unable to get to the other side. The game is filled with these points of no return. There are small areas to scavenge, but after crossing that threshold, there's no returning. No going back for a piece of gear the player might have missed. Obviously, this isn't an open world game by any stretch of the imagination. The game is always pushing the player forward. There are no side quests, there is no way to backtrack, there is only forward momentum. This ultra-linear structure prevents the story from hitting a lull. It is always progressing at the pace the developers have intended. I'd argue that a significant reason The Last of Us' story is so effective is how well it's paced. The action scenes flow into the tense scenes, which flow into the quiet, character-driven scenes, and back again. In order to pull off this balancing act, the game kinda can't hand over the reins of its pacing. The early 2010s saw another trend gain popularity: games in which the player's actions affect the story. Around that time, we saw the release of The Walking Dead, the Mass Effect trilogy, and Heavy Rain. These were good-looking, story-centric games that put the player in undesirable predicaments, forcing them to make tough decisions without a clear-cut best one. The benefit to this style of storytelling is obvious. It gives the player a say in how the story plays out. It allows subsequent runs to be different from the ones before it. It makes the very act of decision-making a key component of the experience. A choose-your-own-adventure story plays out like a series of junctures, ultimately arriving at an ending that is reflective of the decisions that came before. Ideally, the ending the player receives will be satisfying, making them reflect on the tough choices that they've made. But at the same time, this presents a difficult challenge for the developers. Each story path has to be satisfying to some extent. It's hard to tell a single, unified story when there are so many variables in play. It's inevitable that some story paths will just be better than others. There's no guarantee that the path the player is on is the best, most satisfying one. But that's just the risk a developer has to take when working within this framework. The developers of these games have the branches all planned out, but leave the navigation of these branches up to the player. They relinquish their ultimate narrative authority to the audience. By contrast, The Last of Us only tells one story. While the game ostensibly asks, "What would you do in this situation?" it leaves the player out of the decision-making process. The player is forever on the story path the developers think is best. In another game, the player might be given the choice to re-team with the brothers who left them for dead. The relationship between the two central characters might develop differently based on dialogue options. Or certain events could have different outcomes based on the player's skill. But Joel and Ellie will always re-team with Henry and Sam. The main duo will become more codependent. And Tess will always be attacked by the infected, regardless of how quickly the player gets to her. On a second or third playthrough, dread looms over Joel and Ellie's journey across America. Every horrible thing that happens to these characters has been predetermined, the player unable to change anyone's grisly fate. I find it fascinating that The Last of Us, for all the fanfare surrounding it, for all the claims of it pushing the medium forward, stands staunchly opposed to other trends in the gaming space. While games do have the ability to hand over some of their control, The Last of Us refuses. The author retains all its authority. The audience is just along for the ride. The Last of Us is a truly cinema-like experience. To contrast against its rigid story, The Last of Us gives the player quite a bit of freedom when it comes to moment-to-moment gameplay. Each combat encounter in The Last of Us can be tackled in a number of different ways. In this regard, the player has loads of agency. They can tailor their playstyle to suit their sensibilities. And since the game gives the player a large toolkit, they can use the available actions to express themselves. Violently express themselves, but express themselves nonetheless. Hardly anyone wants Joel to live. This world is unbearably hostile, filled with bloodthirsty guards and countless infected. In Joel's case, the best way to make it through the hostility is to be even more hostile. The game will task the player with being the last one alive in a certain environment, and the way the player achieves that goal is entirely up to them. One option is to have Joel sneak around, hide in the shadows, and then spring out to strangle or stab his victim. It's slow, it requires careful maneuvering and patience, but it's quiet. It won't raise the suspicions of the other guards or infected in the area. Another option is to use weapons. The game gives the player plenty of firearms, each with a different strength. Pistols for general use, rifles for distance, and shotguns for close quarters. Which gun the player uses will depend on what type of enemy they're up against, how many of them there are, how close they are to Joel, and how aware they are of his presence. Not to mention, each weapon has its own kind of ammo, which will also determine how much each gun gets used. There's also the bow and arrow, which is kind of the happy medium between stealthing and shooting. It's deadly, but it's also slow and quiet. Throwables are yet another option. Joel can craft Molotov cocktails, setting an area ablaze. He can craft nail bombs that vaporize anything that comes into contact with them. These are great for crowd control, but their quantities are limited. But what if things go south? Joel can also pick up melee weapons, which can be effective in close quarters. These weapons have a limited number of hits and put the player in danger more often, so these are mainly used for a last resort. There are 4 main enemy types, and each of them move in a predictable pattern. Since the enemies will act similarly from encounter to encounter, it's possible to develop reliable strategies at the start of every combat section. Uninfected humans are fully sentient, able to see and hear their surroundings. When engaged, they duck for cover and use their weapons, able to hit Joel from long distances. The regular infected are somewhat aware of their surroundings. When engaged, they run towards their attacker, attempting to strike with brute force. Clickers are blind but react to sound, so it's extra important not to draw their attention, or at least not draw their attention towards you. A single strike from one of these will lead to a game over. And bloaters are the heftiest of the bunch. These are the closest thing The Last of Us has to boss battles. They're big, loud, mean, and will also kill Joel in a single hit. In each combat encounter, the player will be faced with some combination of these enemies. And since the game has given them so many options to take on the foes ahead, they'll have to adjust their strategy on the fly. Taking down a bunch of uninfected guards? Maybe stealth is the best option here. It'll save on ammo and will prevent a room full of guys from shooting at Joel all at once. Only when their numbers have thinned should he bust out the weapons. But taking down a bunch of infected runners? Well, the player will need to be quick and deal a lot of damage in close quarters. Time to go in guns blazing. But taking down a clicker? Well, if they haven't noticed Joel yet, then stealth is the best way forward. Sneak up on them and stab them. But what about when there are common infected and clickers? What's the best order to attack? What if there are just too many to take down? Maybe the player could alert them to the same spot and... While I'm sure expert players have their own strategies to efficiently make it through each encounter, there's no specific way that each encounter has to be done. I played through the section in the bookstore like a stealth mission, but I'm sure it would make a great shooter level too. I could have played this part of the Pittsburgh section a lot smarter, but I made it through. I hardly ever used the bow. Maybe that could have helped in some of the later sections. There's no single right answer. Between encounters, Joel will find raw materials that he can use to craft items. Most notably, both a health kit and a Molotov can be created with a rag and some alcohol, the exact same ingredients. So would you rather craft an item to heal, or craft an item to inflict pain? Both will be useful, but which will be more useful? That's the decision that the player has to make for themselves. There are also weapon parts Joel can use to upgrade his guns. These are finite, and the upgrades are irreversible. Which weapons do you use the most? Which upgrade suits your specific playstyle? It's all up to you. Choose wisely. The Last of Us is built upon a gameplay system that rewards quick thinking, careful decision-making, resource management, and player creativity. When it comes to its gameplay, The Last of Us gives the player endless authority. In the same breath, The Last of Us gives the player no agency whatsoever, and also loads of it. The game gives the player the freedom to make individual decisions that reflect their own sensibilities, but at the same time, those sensibilities have to work within Joel's character. The outcome of the story has already been decided. There is only success and failure. Getting a game over is an inevitable part of life. After failing at a task, the player is sent back a bit. How a game handles a game over can tell us a lot about its intent. Does it send the player back to a checkpoint, or to the start of a level, or to the very beginning? There's no one-size-fits-all solution. It all depends on what the developer is going for. And this developer is concerned with maintaining the story's momentum. For how cruel The Last of Us's world can be, the game is pretty forgiving with its checkpoints. Getting a game over will only set the player back a few minutes at most. So, in a way, it's kind of safe to fail in The Last of Us. Since the game gives the player so many options to take down the foes in each encounter, they're, ironically, safe spaces to experiment with new tactics. And yeah, I'll admit I'm not the best at stealth, and I'm not the best at shooters either, so I was struggling more than I'd like to admit. I watched my Joel get shot, watched him lose a chunk of his neck, I watched him get his head crushed, watched him drown, and watched him get beaten to death. Despite all this death, despite all these unfortunate ends, Joel was fine. He would just warp back a few moments before it all went wrong. He was allowed to make mistake after mistake after mistake, but he was okay. That's how the story goes. Tess is a more capable smuggler than Joel. She is a tutorial personified, helping the player get acclimated to the world and its gameplay systems. The first time Joel shoots his gun, it's at her behest. She helps out in firefights. She can fend for herself just fine. She and Joel got word of a new smuggling job. They met Ellie and learned of her immunity. They did what they could to make their way through Boston, crawled through the crumbling buildings, killed anything that stood in their way. They arrived at the Capitol building to hand the immune girl off and complete the job. But somewhere in all the chaos, Tess became infected. Her journey reached its end. Because that's how the story goes. By this point, I had witnessed Joel die over and over again, on the rooftop, in the rain, in the train station, in the ruined office building, in the very museum where Tess got infected. Joel could make mistake after mistake, find him dying in an endless barrage of impermanent deaths. But Tess could only die once. This is not unique to The Last of Us. Plenty of linear games have unavoidable plot beats, but there's something about this game in particular that makes it feel different from its cinematic contemporaries. And I would argue it's due to the two wildly different philosophies it implements at the exact same time. On the one hand, it's a cinematic experience in the most literal sense. It is a well-paced, character-driven story with no exploration whose plot beats cannot change. On the other, it's a survival-themed, stealth-infused third-person shooter that rewards quick thinking and creative decision-making. So the audience's choices do matter, but only up to a certain point. Is The Last of Us supposed to be viewed as a film that takes the audience on a predetermined journey its authors have intended? Or should it be viewed as an open-ended video game that gives its reins to the player, allowing them to choose what to do? Then again, who really gets to choose anything in a game after all? That implosion in Portal 2? Sure, the player could look away. The game makes a joke about not looking away, but it still puts a flashy implosion in the scene to draw the player's attention. It's there to make the player look at what the developers want them to look at. A side activity in Grand Theft Auto might take away from the main storyline, but it was still designed by the developers. The player gets some sort of benefit from doing these side activities. Sure, the player could just ignore everything that isn't the main story, but is that really realistic? And the many branching storylines in something like Heavy Rain let the player go down different paths, yet they all have been written and acted and designed in advance. The player can choose, but they can't really decide anything that hasn't already been scripted as a choice. The Last of Us is just more overt with its ideology. The game has the pretense of asking, what would you do in this situation? But in reality, it doesn't let the player answer that question for themselves. Instead, it says, this is what you would do in this situation. You would bond with Ellie. You would do anything to protect her. You would risk your life for even the smallest glimmer of hope in this desolate world. You would do these things. You have to. You have no choice. In the same way that the cordyceps fungus controls the bodies of its victims, in the same way that programmed enemies behave in predictable patterns, the characters are trapped in the story the developers have crafted for them. We, the audience, are also trapped. We will use the gun with the most ammo that has been strategically placed by the game's code. We will alternate between stealth and firepower since certain encounters greatly favor one method over another. We will do what the game wants us to do. We will look at the implosion. Likewise, throughout Joel and Ellie's trek, there were reminders of how much the characters can't change. There wasn't anything anyone could do to stop the outbreak. They can find their own ways to survive, be it hiding in an evacuated town, staying on the move, or setting up civilization around an old dam. But there's nothing they can do to go back to how things were before. The problems are much larger than any one of them. There is so much unavoidable misery in this story, from characters' premature ends to Ellie's backstory to the suffering of every character they meet. They are all bound to their unavoidable fates. Except, maybe there is something they can do after all. It's a 1 in a million chance, but maybe, just maybe, it'll be enough to save the world. Joel and Ellie can make a difference. There's not so much a glimmer of hope as there is a glimmer of agency. The thought that one of us can, in fact, break free of a predetermined narrative. We could change the world. But if you've made it to the end of The Last of Us, you know what happens. Joel makes a decision, and he will make that same decision every time. He is trapped in his own linear narrative. That's the genius irony of The Last of Us. From its story to its design, it gives the illusion of choice, yet it is upfront that this is merely an illusion. The player can choose between strangling or shooting those in their way, but they will still have to kill them. A player can fail at an encounter a half dozen times, but the game will still force you to make it through somehow. You have no choice. There is so much in the world outside of our control, so much that it feels overwhelming, that each one of us are small and insignificant in the grand scheme of it all. Yet, at the same time, unlike Joel and Ellie, we aren't bound to the confines of game mechanics. Maybe there is something we can do, something small like snatching an action figure, or agreeing to give someone a thing they need, or simply sticking by someone's side that can make a difference. The eternal clash of agency and no agency, of hope and dread, is what makes this game such a compelling title. We, the audience, are stuck in the middle of the intersection, not quite fully in control of ourselves. But maybe this time, I'll make it past the guards on the rooftop unscathed. Maybe this time, I will escape Boston without a hitch. Maybe this time, I will survive each and every encounter. Maybe this time, I'll make it up the stairs in time to save Tess. Maybe this time, she'll be okay. Yet, as I approach the drop point, the feeling persists. Maybe there was nothing I could do after all. That opening the door will only confirm what we already know. Even if I don't want to, I have to carry out the choice that has already been made for me. I have to walk up to the Capitol building and find out what's inside.